thank you again for coming out tonight. My name is Zach Lockram. How many of you were at the last meeting it's over at Central School? Yeah, in November. Want to say November? Is that right? Yeah. And then we've also had one meeting for some of the business owners back in, was that December? Well, it must have been December now as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about both of those meetings. But thank you for taking the time to come back out and talk with us as we kind of have been moving through this process. This is, I think, one of the kind of fun times. I'm going to actually skip forward a couple slides here to just jump to the timeline of what we're working on. I think this is one of the fun times in this type of project because we've already been able to talk to a lot of people. We've gone out, we've done a big survey. We went and talked to, I think we ended up at a little over 40% of the business owners in the area, and actually were able to talk with them face-to-face about what's been going on with their businesses and what they want to see for the area. We've been able to talk to residents in the area as well. And this is the meeting where we actually come back to you and start to show you some of the ideas that we've been developing. So we're at a point now where it's not totally vetted, not everything is necessarily exactly implementable, it's not quite at that level yet, but it's a place where we can really start to talk together about what some of the real opportunities are and how we want to think about moving them forward. So I always think that this is a really fun place in these projects, and hopefully you will too as we start to be able to talk through some of these ideas. So just to kind of skip back to remind you where we're talking about, this is the Walker Lake District. Our study area does focus entirely on the commercial areas, including the schools as well, but we're not making recommendations around any of the residential areas that are in the area as a part of this particular study. And you know, this is an important piece of St. Louis Park's history. This is an area that was sort of right here at the birth of St. Louis Park. It was one of the first areas that had commercial development. It was one of the first areas that had residential development. And in the intervening time, it's been maybe a little bit off to the side compared to some of the other places in the city. So one of the benefits of that is that we still have a lot of interesting historic buildings. We still have some of the character in the area that we had back when this was, you know, the streetcar stop that you would take to go into or out of Minneapolis. And some of that has been preserved through time. And it really gives us an opportunity to build on that to really make sure that we're capturing the uniqueness of this area within St. Louis Park, capturing that history as we're thinking about what happens as we move, you know, really into the next 100 years. It's an important commercial center in St. Louis Park. There is somewhere in the area of 105 businesses in there, 1,500, 1,600 employees as well. So, you know, not the biggest job center in St. Louis Park, but certainly an important one. And I think one of the things that's really unique here is that this place has a very significant amount of locally owned businesses, businesses that are actually owned by people who live in St. Louis Park, family-owned businesses, businesses that have been here a long time. It's not the same stuff that you see in every suburb that you go to around the Twin Cities. There's a lot of really unique things here in the area, and that's also, you know, one of the real opportunities that we have here in the area. So as I said, we're kind of in this sort of big second phase here, which is when we're thinking about what is the plan actually going to be? What are we actually going to do to move forward? And we're going to be taking feedback from you here today and really beginning to move that forward. But as you remember from our previous meeting, we're also building off a whole lot of previous work that's been done in this area, really starting, you know, as much as 3-4 years ago, thinking about what the Walker Lake area is going to be, how do we activate it, what kind of businesses do we want to see here, as well, of course, of the St. Louis Park Comprehensive Plan and all of the work that's gone into that in thinking about what are the values, what are the ideas, what are the things we want to carry forward in St. Louis Park as a whole. So as I said, we had a first meeting with people from the community back over at Central School. That happened back in November. We had, luckily before the weather got too bad, one of our staff was actually out knocking on doors, sitting down and talking with folks who own businesses in the area. One of the things that we've always found when we're doing these kind of projects is that It can be sometimes hard for someone who owns a business and runs a business to make it to meetings like this, so we wanted to make sure that we were actually out and talking to them kind of where they are. If you run a restaurant, this is your heavy hour right now when it's dinner time, so it can make it kind of difficult. And then we've also had some really good meetings actually sitting down with a larger group of business owners, with landowners, with building owners in the area, and talking about what some of the opportunities are for that group to actually be able to take a real stake in thinking about what the future of the district is and how they can actually work and coordinate together. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on. So as I said, there's a lot of work that's already been done in this area. And so the approach that we wanted to take was to make sure that rather than just coming back and starting over and asking everybody all over again, what is it you want to see, we were taking the work that had previously been done and trying to think about the things that had already been identified and what might be the barriers to making those actually happen. So what's been getting in the way of actually achieving some of the things that we want to see. So some of the things that had come up as a part of that, I think overall this idea of creating a unique district and destination, really creating something exciting that people want to go to, that people know about, has been something that's been in every plan that's been done around this area, and something that I think we've been moving towards strongly. There's a strong sense of wanting to preserve and promote the district's historic buildings and the unique history within the city. We want to talk about how to bring new businesses that help activate the district and how those businesses fit in to the larger fabric of this community. Improving aesthetics, the streetscapes, the sidewalks, those sorts of areas. And then another thing that had come up in some of these was potentially using some of the alleys as gathering spaces and trying to create some new public spaces and public art, things like that in the area as well. So we've been taking some of those ideas as well as the feedback that we've received, and I'm going to jump a little bit into some of the work that we've been doing and trying to think about some of those things. And I'm going to actually start with parking, so I'm going to turn it over to Chris here with SRF to talk a little bit about what we've seen so far as we've studied the parking.
All right. So thank you, everybody. My name is Chris Ryan. Thanks, Zach. I'm from SRF Consulting. We are assisting the city and Asakura Robinson with this study. The purpose of, or really our role in this project, was to get a good objective sense of the parking situation in the Walker Lake area. You can see the map here shows parking infrastructure. It's provided through a variety of on-street parking spaces, through public on-street parking, off-street private parking, and also a handful of off-street public parking spaces and lots throughout the city. One of the things that we also looked at in addition to the capacity was how much is it actually being utilized. We took a team throughout the day and went out and actually surveyed how many people are parking in each of these spots at the 9 o'clock hour, the noon to 1 o'clock hour, and then the evening 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock hour. And, sorry, I'll stand over here. The result of that exercise is shown here in this chart, which might be a little difficult to read from a distance here, but it is also displayed on the board over here if you want to get a more detailed look at it. One of the things this shows us is the balance of how many private spaces there are in the area. There are quite a few more private spaces compared to public supply. But this also shows you how much each of those spaces is utilized. So for an example here, this zone 12 here, this is essentially the central high school. You can tell in the morning and in the afternoon, lunchtime, it's very full. Nearly all of the private spaces are being used, and even quite a few of the public spaces are being used. But even as we get into the 6 p.m. hour, the percent utilization goes down a lot because, as you would expect, all of the students and faculty that are parking there are no longer, are moving on to other things, going home, and so on and so forth. I think what this chart really illustrates the most to me is that there is sufficient parking availability in the city as a whole. It's not to say there aren't exceptions here or there. I would say the number one parking capacity issue we saw was actually with the Park Tavern just down the street, which I'm sure you're probably familiar with that if you live in the area. But really that was the only individual lot that we saw was actually over capacity and people were flowing into the roadways. But aside from that, there really was, we did not see a lot of capacity issues. And so, is there another clicker, or do we just? Okay. All right. So one of the things that tells us is that a strategy that may be implemented here is what's known as a district parking approach. Right now, the current parking approach is that if you have a certain business, there is a minimum parking requirement based on what type of business you have. In many cases in this city, the requirements are such that you would actually need to tear down, historic buildings and other buildings in the neighborhood to get enough space to make that work. The alternative approach of a district parking plan, it assumes that we can share parking between compatible uses. So for an example, this chart here is showing a restaurant, residential parking requirements, and an office parking requirements. And under the traditional model, we require all of these spaces to be provided, even if throughout the course of the day, you might have a situation where an office, the parking demand is not steady throughout the day. It peaks about lunchtime, in the middle of the afternoon. A restaurant parking demand will peak at lunch and then peak even more in the afternoon. So if you have something like a restaurant and an office, their demand might actually balance out such that you can share some of the parking if it's co-located close enough to make use of that. An example we have here is business A and business B, and we're showing a 1/8 mile walk shed, which is roughly approximately what a person could reasonably walk to get to their place of business or their final location. And what we show is this is overlapping this triangle area here with, what's the name of the lot? Is that the Gorham? That's the Walker Lake lot. So in this example, this could be a defined parking district where instead of requiring the minimum number of spaces, we could develop a system where we look at it in the totality of all the businesses that are there, what are the individual parking needs, and making sure that within that district there is sufficient parking based on that ebb and flow of demand throughout the day. So
I think one of the other things that we're looking at to really think about how a system like this works too is one of the things that I think was really revealed in actually looking at where people are parking right now is that there's a lot of spots in the area that people don't know about. There's a lot of public spots that people don't know about. And so there's a lot of spots where literally on one side of buildings you might have 60% utilization and you've got cars there all the time, and then, just literally 100, 200 feet away, you've got spots where there's only 20% utilization. So as we're thinking about these strategies, we're also going to be thinking about how do we make sure that people actually know where parking spots are available, make sure that the signs are uniform. I noticed actually just driving in on Lake Street today, there's a sign that says 30-minute parking, and then about 100 feet down the road, there's a sign that says 1 hour parking. And then 30 feet down the road from that, there's another sign that says 1 hour parking this block only. So the signs aren't uniform. They don't make sense together. There's no reason why one of those is 30-minute, one of them's an hour, and then there's another one that's an hour, which, those are the same, but they're totally different signs. So why is that happening? How can we think about unifying those and making sure that those all fit? We also have a situation where we really, there's only a few main roads that lead into this area. You've got Walker, you've got Lake, you've got Library off on the side. How can we make sure that right when people turn into those areas, they right away see a sign that says parking this way, and that leads them to those places where we actually want them to park? So making sure that all of those things are really working together to create a situation where we're not constraining what development can happen in the area based on that type of parking. So along those lines, one of the things that's come across as a really strong goal is the desire to really preserve some of the historic buildings and make sure that new building that's coming into the area does fit within that character. And so we've begun working on some ideas around how design guidelines could be structured for the area. So this is something that, is an overlay over your zoning code and would actually have a little bit stricter requirements for development that happens in this area in order to help it kind of fit within the context of what happens here. So, making sure that what new is built really is a good neighbor, that it fits in well, and that it really fits in as a part of the area. Now, as a part of that, we can also look at design guidelines for the public realm. So what do the sidewalks look like? can we have uniform street furniture? And so there's a uniform look to the area in terms of the ways that things are set up. If we have commercial buildings, maybe we should have 10-foot sidewalks instead of 5-foot sidewalks so that people can actually walk next to each other as they're shopping. Those sorts of things are all things that we can actually look at requiring. And so we've started to look at what some of those standards might be for the public realm as well. We've been thinking a little bit about architectural styles. And one of the things that there's kind of two camps when you talk about preserving historic places. So there's groups out there that think that the best way to do it is to make sure that anything new that's built sort of looks like, exactly like the historic stuff. So using historical styles as a part of development. And then there's kind of another camp out there that says anything that's new that's built can't do that. So we want the historic stuff to look historic and we want the new stuff to look new. And so there are trade-offs with both of those. So we've begun to think a little bit about and talk with some of the landowners and business owners and folks like yourself to get their opinion on what they would like to see in the area and how that might also fit in. As a part of this, we also have to look at the regulatory changes. And one of the things that became really clear to us as we were looking at both the parking piece of things as well as looking at the zoning code is that some of the things that people have said that they actually want to move into this place wouldn't be allowed under the regulatory code. And so we have an opportunity to look at that code and say, okay, these are things that have been identified by the community. We need to make sure that we have a regulatory environment that actually fits that and actually would allow those things. So some of those things are things like brewery, distillery, food hall, looking at things like food trucks as a possibility in some of these areas, co-working spaces. And also, this model that we're actually starting to see a little bit of in the district, which is, as retail is changing, it's getting harder and harder for small retailers to actually survive. And one of the ways that some retailers have found to survive is actually doing most of their sales online. So they'll still have a retail space, but they might have a furniture company where they build their furniture on site, they sell most of it online, but they also have a retail space. That's something that we're actually seeing a little bit in this area. Places like Soda Clothing actually do most of their sales online. So making sure that our code is flexible enough to allow that sort of thing to actually happen and continue to happen in the district and really create opportunities for people to be makers in the area. Now, we believe pretty strongly that when we're talking about places, it's not just the city's responsibility to get everything done. It's the responsibility of the people who live there to participate. It's the responsibility of the businesses that live there that can participate. And one of the things that we've begun working on is the development of a business organization. So probably something like a merchants association that could get together and actually be able to help market the area and do some other things that would help support the city and some of what the city is doing as well, but would also give business owners and landowners a way to talk more consistently with the city, to have a greater voice by really being unified in doing that. So we had a really great meeting. We had about 20 business owners who joined us back in December for a first meeting to kind of talk about this, and we just went through some brainstorming about what are the types of things that you would like to see an organization like this do. So one of them was things like shared resources. So how can they market together, do communications, is there one website that can point people to everything? Could we actually develop a map and like pamphlets that show all the different businesses in the area and help coordinate that sort of thing? They talked about wanting to do programming and events. So thinking about, things like the train that we've had out here. So we've had some successful events in the area, but what other types of things could we do together if we were able to get together to do that? People talked about coordination with the city. So coordinating issues that people are having with the code, coordinating issues that people are having with construction or other things like that, and having a sort of go-to point person in terms of being able to communicate things that are challenges to the area. And then there's things that we call kind of placemaking. So public art, murals, you've seen the new banners that we have out, those sorts of things. But this can also get into stuff like public safety, graffiti abatement, snow removal. There's all kinds of different things that can actually be coordinated among businesses rather than having individual businesses sort of be responsible for each of those things on their own. So finally, we've started to think about some of the wayfinding in public spaces. And as I already told you, I think one of the things that we feel is really important is thinking through the ways that we understand where parking is and that we can get people where they need to go so that they park and they're able to get out and walk around and visit different shops and so on. The other side of that, besides just having the signs, is making sure we have the sidewalks everywhere. So we went through the whole area and identified the areas that don't have sidewalks yet, so that we can look at what needs to get developed in those areas. As I mentioned, we have kind of these three major entrances to the area, these kind of gateways. So we want to think about what some of the opportunities are for those gateways. How do we call out the area and make it more apparent that it's here? I think there's a lot of people who go up and down Highway 7 without really knowing what's back over in here, and trying to make that something that people can understand. Looking at some of the cool places that could actually fit public art. And we've actually begun having some conversations with St. Louis Park Friends of the Arts about some grant opportunities to actually do some cool art in the area too, which is really exciting to us. And then looking at the places where we need to help make connections for pedestrians, especially with things like the new light rail coming, and how are people going to get from that station that's on the other side of Highway 7 over into the area and make sure that that's possible for them. There's been some specific requests too, things like, could we find a good place for a dog park in this area? That's something that people have wanted to see over here. Thinking about reusing some of the city-owned land to try out a food truck park or some other thing like that. That's something the city hasn't done before, but that would bring some attention into the area and maybe a little more foot traffic into some of the spaces. So we've begun to think about all of those and working on, kind of developing out some of these ideas like the dog park, looking at some of these sort of shared street ideas. So these are streets that are designed for cars, and most of the time there's cars on them, but they're also easy to shut down, and you can actually do festivals, or when the Park High School is having their football games, you can close it down and kind of be able to do different things with it, so they're a little more flexible in those ways. We've also been looking at some more of the wayfinding ideas, and when we look at these sorts of signs and think about that, we always talk about the 3Ds. So there's the destination, where are people going to be able to get to, the direction, so that's the arrow, and then there's the distance. And we've been playing around with a few different ways of doing that, but kind of the traditional one is like, the library's a quarter mile that way. Well, how many of you really know exactly how far a quarter mile is when you're walking? Does that work? So looking at, this one is 5 minutes instead. So, it's an average. It's not going to be exactly that for every person. But that helps people to actually understand how long it's actually going to be when they're doing it. This one is, and we've been seeing these lately because everyone's obsessed with getting their 10,000 steps now. It's 500 steps to that. It's 600 steps to that. So it gives people a way of thinking about that. But then also looking at some of these gateways and like how might we actually create some places when people are actually coming into the area that help really brand the area and set the area up as well. So we have a small enough group. I kind of think what I'd like to do is actually pull a couple of these tables together and just have a little bit more of a conversation rather than kind of breaking out, since there's not that many of us. But some of the things that we want to talk about are, what additional opportunities should we consider? Do we miss anything? Are there things that you really don't like? Are there things that you really do like? What challenges do you see to actually being able to implement some of these things? And really, we can have a pretty wide-ranging conversation. And we also have all of this information in more detail over here. We also have a lot more information in our heads, too. So anything that there's questions about, we'd be happy to kind of talk about more.